Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy.
Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast for yet another episode with Dr. Eric Helms. Eric, welcome once again.
Thank you for having me back on.
So today, Eric and listeners, what I want to do is make this into a bit of a history podcast. And first, Eric, I'm going to start with our history, mine and yours, our podcasting history, going all the way back to episode 8, which was your very first podcast appearance on here, as well as my very first guest podcast appearance. Guest podcast interview. I was appearing in every one, obviously. So in that episode, we talked about programming for hypertrophy. And one of the main variables that we discussed to design a hypertrophy-oriented program was volume.
Yeah.
But the most important, the most poignant comment that you made in that podcast was when you said to me that you thought that the number one problem in the world was that people aren't jacked enough. But unfortunately, most researchers do not seem to share that view. So you proceeded to explain to me that this is the reason why most research on resistance training is underpowered, meaning we don't have a lot of participants, and we need to wait for a meta-analysis to bring all these studies together. And that's when this year we got a new meta-analysis with a series of meta-regressions on volume and frequency and their relationship with hypertrophy, and technically with strength too. At least that's what the researchers studied as well. I don't care about strength very much, so I'm gonna ignore those results. No, I don't ignore them, I'm just not that interested. I just care about big muscles, I have my priorities straight. So listeners, this meta-analysis with meta-regressions is a preprint, and it's currently available to everyone to read for free, which is amazing. So you'll find a link in the show notes. And in terms of making this a history-related podcast on volume, my first question to you, Eric, with regards to discussing volume and getting to these meta-analysis and what the researchers did and found is, before this meta-analysis was completed, can you tell us a little bit about what the state of the evidence was between when we last spoke in 2022 about volume and the preprint now in 2024, and what your stance was on volume in relation to hypertrophy based on this evidence and your own coaching experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love the way you frame that. And I would say this is, if I think about it, maybe our fourth or fifth generation of meta-analysis, and I say that broadly, meta-regression or systematic review with some element of quantitative assessment of resistance training variables for hypertrophy. And if we kind of go backwards, like you said, and we go to 2022, we were just one generation ago, but probably on our third or fourth, depending upon how you count it. And we had a decent amount of data. We had two separate analyses, the most recent by Bas Val, a great researcher out of Spain, who wanted to look at higher volume comparisons, specifically because more high volume research had come out. And the prior Gen 3, I think if I got my generations right, meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues, it looked at three different categories of volume. It looked at 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus, although they also did a continuous analysis of their data, which I'll explain what that means in a bit. And they concluded that 10 plus sets in most of their analyses was either significantly or non-significantly better than lower volumes or greater than 9, or that there was simply a positive relationship when looking at their continuous relationship between more sets and more hypertrophy for that muscle group. So considering that kind of ended around 10 plus, that is when Bas Val said, you know what, we need to take a look at some of these higher volume studies that have been published. So let's compare 12 to 20 to 20 plus. And they didn't actually do any type of meta-analysis for the lower volume ranges. They just kind of systematically reviewed it qualitatively. And their conclusions were relatively similar with some additional nuance. There were fewer high volume studies than there are now, which is important to point out. And they looked at triceps, they looked at biceps, they looked at quadriceps, and the only significant effect was actually in the triceps, which is also an interesting finding that I think will become more apparent as we discuss the most recent meta-regression as to why that might be. But everything leaned in favor of higher volumes with an indication that things were starting to plateau somewhere around that 20 plus mark. So my stance at that time was that there's generally a better response for hypertrophy as you do more and more volume, but it's going to plateau and it could potentially lead to what we describe as the inverted U, where there's a point where you do additional work and it starts working against you. You might see a slower rate of hypertrophy as you're doing more than you can effectively recover from, or at the very least, there's probably this large plateau region where you're doing more work, but you're not getting anything back. So it's at least a potential waste of time. And when you think about just the way that we assess risk, it is per hours of training. And while that risk isn't necessarily linear, you would imagine if you're just doing more training but not getting any additional adaptation from it, at least the one you want, which would be hypertrophy in this case, that would just be potentially unhelpful. It might expose you to a slightly higher risk just because more time spent in the gym, not anything magical about, higher risk being associated with higher volumes. So that was where we were when we podcasted last. But there were two earlier generations than that. There were some meta-analyses done by Krieger in around the 2010 period, if I recall correctly, comparing single set protocols to multi-set protocols. And these were just simply what I would describe as a categorical comparison. Just is one set better or worse than multiple sets? And pretty consistently, the findings were that multiple set protocols induced more hypertrophy than single set protocols. And then the true Gen 1, for all the people who were around reading research papers back in the day, was I think 2007, it might be 2008, I always forget, by Wernbaum and colleagues, which was a systematic review which had not a proper weighted, meta-analysis, but they had a quantitative synthesis looking at different rates of muscle gain when you manipulated different variables. And one of them was volume, and they actually counted total number of reps. And they looked at different just percentage rates of increases in groups that did more or less total reps across all their work. And this, if people are real old school fans of my work and they read the first edition, which came out end of 2015, I think was when we did our pre-sale of my muscle and strength pyramids, they'll notice that my recommendations are actually total number of reps per muscle group, not total number of sets. And that was one of the biggest changes in the volume chapter, or the volume intensity and frequency chapter that came out in the second editions when they came out end of 2018, early 2019. So that's kind of the history lesson of how we've just basically adopted the most recent big picture analysis that we have that takes more things into account. But the most recent one that's come out by Pelland and colleagues has a lot of strengths to it, and it really does a great job in terms of stating its limitations. The authors should be commended. It has substantially more power. The analysis has a little over 1,000 total participants across all the studies that are included. And they did an excellent job from a quantitative perspective, giving us not just a categorical comparison, but more importantly, a regression, which is being able to actually provide a predictor of what happens when you compare lower to higher volumes in terms of sets. And they also found probably a better way of counting volume that's more representative of the fit of the data when we look at all these studies collectively together. So I'll plant that seed and then I'll hand it back over to you.
And it would be remiss of me not to mention that the authors also have their own podcast. Oh my God, it's escaping my
The
mind.
Data-Driven
Data
Strength
driven,
podcast.
yes, the Data Driven Strength podcast. I should know that, considering they created in total about 8 hours of content, including an interview with you. And I listened to all of that, and I still managed to forget right now when I needed the name the most. Anyway, people.
Well, Nick, if it was the Data-Driven Hypertrophy podcast, I guarantee you'd be listening to it more often, and you'd never forget.
That's the problem. I only became aware of them in 2020 because they were called strength, and I don't care about strength. They don't have their priorities right, in my
That's
view.
right.
Anyway, people, I will put a link to that show in the show notes as well, because if you want to dive really deeply into this particular research and also just listen to what the guys have to say, they are very well spoken and articulate on these topics of strength and hypertrophy, then you can definitely look into their podcast as well. But staying with us here, the next question that I have, Eric, is it's interesting that you brought up the strengths of this new meta-analysis, because I was actually going to ask you to describe what the authors did, framing it within the answer to the question, what did they want to address? What kind of limitations in the previous research we had did they want to address, and how they did it in this paper?
Yeah, great framing. I think the most important thing we'll come back to is the concept of a continuous versus a categorical comparison. A lot of meta-analyses, so the way basically a traditional meta-analysis is done is you have an inclusion criteria, and it requires that all the studies are similar enough to be reasonably grouped together. You follow certain guidelines, and then you get a pooled effect estimate, and it either is in favor of the outcome you're studying, or it's not. So another example would be, let's say you just want to do a meta-analysis of does higher protein or lower protein favor hypertrophy. And let's say you didn't do a continuous analysis, and this was just, okay, any time that there was a trial where they gave supplemental protein or prescribed a higher protein and a lower protein intake, we just want to say, which way did it go? And this doesn't necessarily tell you at what's an appropriate point for protein to be beneficial. It doesn't tell you about, say, like a non-linear relationship, like does going up to a certain point be beneficial and then it starts to plateau? Hint hint, it does. If you read the protein research, it just tells you, hey, when we compare higher versus lower in any individual study, whether that's 0.5 grams per kilogram, like really low, to 1, which we would consider low but higher than 0.5, did that do better? Or in other comparisons, is 2 grams per kilogram better than 1.5, both which could be argued to be moderate to high. And it gives you some value. And I think as I state that, you can probably imagine some of the limitations, right? If there is a plateauing effect, well, what if we compare a higher versus a lower protein intake, but both are over that plateau point, right? And then as far as the actual practical applicability, just simply knowing that higher is better than lower protein, you could take someone who's eating a unnecessarily high protein intake and they go, oh, I should eat more. But it can't always be that you should do more. It's probably relative to some starting point. A continuous analysis, and rather than telling you whether than A is greater than B or vice versa, it tells you the relationship between two variables. And this is where the regression part comes in. People are probably familiar with the concept of regressions or correlations in single studies. And this is essentially an extension of that. If I was to do a study of height and weight, and I would actually want to plot those two things on a graph. If I had my y-axis is height, my x-axis is weight, I would see a pretty strong relationship, because generally, as human bodies get taller, they also weigh more. But it's not the only thing that explains someone's body mass. If they have a larger bone structure, if they weight train, if they have higher levels of adiposity, those things can independently increase your body mass, even if your height doesn't change. So if we were to look at this graph in a single study, we would say sample 100 people, chuck them on a scale, chuck them on a stadiometer, plot this. I would guess maybe 70% of the relationship between height and weight was explained by one another. So we would have some type of R score that would be around 0.8 something. And if we were to do an R squared score, which just explains the amount of variance, that would probably be around 0.6, 0.7, somewhere in there, right? That's a concept a lot of people are familiar with. You can do that in Excel pretty simply. The idea of a meta regression is just doing that on a broader level. Instead of each one of those data points being an individual person, they're actually the study groups from all of the various studies that are included in this meta analysis that has a meta regression. And then to add even more layers of complexity, instead of just looking at the direct relationship between height and weight, we need to think about, okay, well, what is the relative power, the sample size of each one of these groups? And if each one of these, and if there's multiple groups from the same study, how do I correct and weight these studies properly to account for multiple comparisons from the same group? And how do I account for all the potential random effects that are going to differ because these studies are not all studying exactly the same thing? They tell us an outcome, change in muscle size, and they have resistance training and they have participants, but the actual study design in each one of these cases has a lot of heterogeneity. One might be a study just on bicep curls on untrained individuals. Another might be a full body training protocol with well trained individuals. One study might be on women, one might be on men, one might be on older people, younger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One might use machines, free weights, all kinds of things, right? So there are various statistical methods to account for all of those elements of heterogeneity or differences between studies so that you can make sure that you're not just providing some unbalanced or unweighted assessment, which could potentially confound the true relationship. So that is the principal advantage of doing a continuous analysis. It's also much more useful if we see that there is a relationship that's not just more is better than less. We can tell you, well, at what point is more no longer better than less? Or does it have some type of different shape? And the authors spent a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out what was the quote unquote best fit to their model. So, modeling, if you really want to call it a model, the appropriate way to do this is you look at the actual data and then you figure out what's the best way to describe this relationship. So, you try various different mathematical fitting procedures to see if it is just a straight up linear relationship, which would be every time I do another set, it gives me a predictable similar amount of hypertrophy back. Hint, hint, that's not what it is. Or is there some type of other relationship? Could there be that inverted U, where we look at the higher volume studies and they're actually growing slower than the lower volume studies? Or could there be a diminishing returns effect, which is actually what they found, where yes, there's a dose response relationship. The more volume you do, there's greater hypertrophy. But with each given unit of additional volume, you get less efficiency, less return on investment over time. So the art of fitting the data best as you can to the curve, if you will, or the model you use is something that they really agonized over, and I think they did a fantastic job. And you don't want to overfit it. If you imagine just that same XY plot, you're going to have some people who are short but really muscular, big bone structure, and relatively high in body fat. They're going to be way at the top, right? Wouldn't want to draw a line from the person who was your kind of quote unquote normal short person who weighs a predictable amount by that model to go all the way up and then go all the way down and act like, oh, there's something magical that happens at 5'2.5" where everyone gets heavier than they come back down. You go, no, that's variance in the data, and we're relatively confident that that is not the norm. Now, of course, that's possible. We need to account for that uncertainty and that variability among humans. But if I was to tell you on average, someone at 5'2.5", no, they don't weigh 100 kilos. They typically weigh 60 kilos or something like that. I would need to have a model that told me a couple things. It would need to give me kind of this shape of the data, like a line you could see. But I would also want to know how uncertain it was and how much variability there was. So you could have some type of graphical representation showing the dispersion of all the individuals of different heights. And I would also want to know, okay, you can draw a line through any, various dots and you can make it look flat, straight, high, like anytime you draw a trend line through a group of data, it makes the trend look much stronger because your eye is drawn to the line, not the dots. So let's actually get a mathematical understanding of how much of this variance does this relationship explain? Because we're observing hypertrophy in all these studies where they did resistance training. And we see higher volumes resulting in higher hypertrophy. But that's not the way we should conceptualize it. It's not only the higher volumes that cause the higher hypertrophy. What about the fact that they were sleeping, eating in a calorie surplus? What about their genetics? What about the exercises they were using? So we need to understand to what degree does the relationship between volume and hypertrophy explain that relationship? And I'll give a little hint just so people understand that we don't take this too far. Just because higher volumes are associated with higher hypertrophy doesn't mean it's the only thing that does that. And indeed, only about 25% or a quarter of the total variance in hypertrophy seem to be related to volume. That means that 3/4 of who you are, the environment you're in, and what you're doing in the gym and in the kitchen, and literally everything else in the world that we think could result in a modification to how much you're growing is also influencing hypertrophy. So that's a useful thing to put it into context. And those aspects of the analysis are easy to miss or not understand if you don't understand some of the basic fundamental statistics that go into it. So to recap, the continuous nature helps us understand the pros and cons of doing higher volume. It helps us understand the relationship beyond just a simple linear trend. And the fact that it was a big meta-analysis and meta-regression, and they did a lot of efforts to describe how they're going to count the sets to determine the relationship, and that they were doing it in a continuous fashion gives more practical applicability and also helps us better understand this relationship on the whole. So there's more I could talk about, but I think it's probably worth talking about how they counted the data, which was a change compared to previous analyses, which I think is even more useful than what we had previously.
Yes, in fact, great minds think alike, because I was just going to circle back to what you said earlier about the set quantification method that they used. And I assume you're going to also circle back to what you said about the tricep results in the Bas-Val meta-analysis. So I'm going to let you go on about that.
For sure, yeah. So if we look back at Bas-Val and if we look back at Schoenfeld, the way they quantified volume, because any relationship that is not very like all right, if we want to look at height, right, we're probably going to use inches or centimeters. If we want to use weight, we're probably going to use body mass. And this relationship would change a little bit if all of a sudden we decided to use body volume, right, or something like that. So you have to think about the quote unquote construct of what you're measuring. And height and weight are pretty clear. We have very clear established concepts. There's no ambiguity to those. There's just different units. But volume and hypertrophy can be measured in various different ways. Are we looking at muscle thickness? Are we looking at muscle volume? Are we looking at lean body mass, fat-free mass? Are we looking at circumference changes? So one important thing that they did in the most recent meta-regression is they only included studies that looked at direct measures of hypertrophy. So we're not looking at body composition changes via DEXA or some kind of estimation equation that tells you kilograms of total lean tissue, which is not specific to a given muscle, might not even be related to muscle if bone density goes up or something like that. They only looked at measures of MRI or ultrasound or, say, computed tomography to get an assessment of local changes in muscle size, cross-sectional area, thickness, or volume, almost in every single case, if I recall correctly. Previous meta-analyses didn't only do this. Sometimes they did look at body composition changes, and they also, then switching to the variable relating hypertrophy to volume, they counted volume a certain way. Because some people will say, oh, volume, that's sets times reps times load, volume load. Like I mentioned earlier, Wernbaum counted volume as total number of reps performed on a given exercise. Bas-Val and Schoenfeld did it as the number of sets performed, which a muscle group was included on. But they did it so that everything was counted on equal footing, meaning that if you did a bench press, it would be counted as a set towards the pecs as well as the triceps. And if they measured that outcome in the study, then you could look at that relationship. So you could do a study on bench press, ultrasound the tricep, ultrasound the pec, look at the change, and here's where you're getting some of these relationships. Now, they didn't report on pec hypertrophy, but there are various studies which do back work and look at biceps. And you almost never look at the back. In fact, I'm not sure of any longitudinal studies that have looked at, say, lat hypertrophy, because it's a challenging thing to measure. But most of our measurements of hypertrophy are in the quads, biceps, and triceps, with other but less work being done in like the pec, the glutes, and a few other muscle sites like the hamstrings and calves. So anyway, when you count volume in this way, there's an immediate disconnect between the real world and the way we think things operate. And that's always the case. There's a famous quote from a statistician, George Box, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So the goal is to make your model as useful as possible. So anytime we are basing our understanding of the relationship between volume and hypertrophy off of Basval or Schoenfeld, people go, well, I don't want to count a set for a full, like a bench press is a full set for triceps. And I say, yeah, you probably, I mean, that's not the way it works in the real world. Like if you told me you're going to do a skull crusher or a bench press, I'd probably predict you'd grow more from the skull crusher. And they go, okay, well then, okay, so I should do 10 plus sets, but I'm not going to count it as a full set towards the triceps. And I go, well, hold on. Our understanding of why you should do 10 plus sets came from counting it that way. So you can't extrapolate and then just change the language midway through, or it won't translate. So the cool thing that Robinson and colleagues, Pelland and colleagues did, Robinson is one of the other co-authors, is that they specifically tried different methods of counting to see what best fit the data. Because we have the data. They can look out on these 1,000 participants, all the dots on this graph, and go, okay, cool. We see hypertrophy, we see volume, but what does the relationship look like? Is it better fit? Is our curve fitting this data better if we count it in different ways? And they tried 3 different counting methods. One, they did the same way as Basval and Schoenfeld did, counting everything 1-to-1. Bench press counts equally for triceps and pec, 1-to-1 set to set. The next one they tried is, you know what, let's not count it for the triceps at all. We're only going to count direct sets. Bench press only counts for the prime mover. And then the final one they did is called the fractional method, where they said, you know what, let's count all the secondary muscle groups, like the triceps and the bench press, as half a set and see what that relationship looks like. And in fact, that one had the strongest and best fit. And that's what they went with. So there's a slight disconnect in the language used by Schoenfeld and Basval. What they mean by 20 sets for triceps, for example, would be all the sets of tricep pushdowns and skull crushers or other tricep isolation exercises you use, added to all the sets of pressing you do. So shoulder press, bench press, dips, what have you. And that all counts together, which might be why they saw that higher volumes were better for triceps. Because a lot of different or a lot of different pressing exercises don't really take some of the triceps through long muscle length. They don't train the long head, which is biarticular, and the overall measurement of muscle volume, thickness, or change in the tricep might be getting dampened by counting all this volume that doesn't have a major impact on it. So that's potentially what Basval was seeing, at least I think. Now, instead of counting that all equally, we would say, okay, cool, we're going to take all your shoulder pressing, chest pressing, dips, etc. Those all count as half a set for your triceps, and all the direct tricep work, that counts as a full set. So it changes a little bit how you would count a given program to see how it lines up to this meta-analytic data. And I think that's a really cool feature. And even then, though, the model is improved, but it's still wrong. And here's an example. It's not literally true that a bench press is half as effective for your triceps or your chest. And in fact, that's going to differ from person to person to person based upon their arm length, how effectively they know how to bench press, right? Also, it therefore assumes that an overhead press, a bench press, a decline, dips, any pressing exercise is equally effective for your triceps. That's probably not true. And then it also assumes that every tricep isolation movement is equally effective to one another. Yes, that guy standing in the gym doing the swingy tricep kickback with the dumbbell, that is one of the worst exercises on the planet, is just as good as doing a cable overhead tricep extension, which we know is not true. We have studies showing that one tricep exercise produces more triceps hypertrophy than the other. But when we take a bird's eye view and we're looking at dozens of studies across 1,000 people, and we average everything and we hold all else constant, which is what meta-analyses do, which is so easy to forget and why they're frequently misinterpreted or interpreted too literally, that's when we see that the best fit to that data is this fractional counting method. And it could be that for you, Nick, bench press is worth 0.6 sets. And for me, it's worth 0.4. But on average, across 1,000 people, 0.5, half a set, is a decent estimation for us to understand the relationship between volume and sets. Or sorry, hypertrophy and number of sets.
That is such an interesting feature of this particular meta-analysis I found. So focusing on the results, we mentioned that there is a dose response between volume and hypertrophy, but there are diminishing returns. And I'm wondering what the degree to which these diminishing returns seem to occur is.
Yeah. They do a really good job with one of their figures. They talk about these different efficiency tiers, which I like. And you can read the full text for that. I think it's, maybe figure about halfway through. And they do a couple really cool things. For one, they try to establish what the minimum effective dose is to produce measurable hypertrophy. An important caveat here is this is not the minimum effective dose it takes to grow at all. That is almost certainly just relative to what you are currently adapted to. And one set, if you're doing no sets, at some point will produce measurable hypertrophy for sure in almost everybody. But again, the average length of the studies included in this analysis were about 10 and a half weeks. So what they did is they looked at previous research on control groups who were not performing resistance training. So they used previously published data where they had studies, and this is not very common in sports science, but is decently common enough to do this analysis in the first place, where they have a group doing resistance training and a group not doing resistance training. And in randomized controlled trials, we use control groups to make sure that the effect of whatever we're doing is real. Now, we're pretty damn confident that resistance training does grow muscle and strength. So in modern research, we've gotten away from using control groups, although it is still sometimes done, especially when there's multiple comparisons of different things that could hopefully influence an outcome. So for example, a health-based study where we want to see a change in, say, disease risk might have a nutritional intervention, a resistance training intervention, a drug, and then a supplement, and have a multi-site trial, big funded study, go NIH or UK or whoever's funding the study. And then we have a control group doing nothing. And if we have measures of body composition change, or let's say hypertrophy, let's say the quadricep, in that example, we would be able to see, okay, what is the typical variation in someone's quadricep muscle size from doing nothing, right? Just living their life. Because we would want to see a change that's more than the upper end of that typical variation if it was, sometimes increasing in our resistance training group, to know that resistance training caused a real change, a meaningful, measurable change that we can say is more than what would just be occurring naturally in their day-to-day lives. So from a previous analysis of a lot of different control groups in resistance training research, they were able to establish, hey, the minimum measurable change with the types of methods that are included in our current meta-regression is about a 2% increase in muscle size, averaged across these methods. So what does it take to see a 2% change over 10 and a half weeks? That's about 4 sets. So 4 sets per muscle group using a fractional counting method was the initial tier of this efficiency range. Hey, you want to see measurable growth over a 2 to 3 month period? Doing 4 sets on a given exercise, all else equal, important caveat, is probably sufficient. And then they went, okay, for every incremental change where you get another 2%, where it's another measurable change over the same time period, how much more volume do you have to do? And you see that there's this progressive increase. Each time you want to see another 2%, it's not just another 4 sets. So going from 4 to 8 is not going to produce 4%. You actually have to get in the 5 to 10 range. So on average, they go, you need to add about 6 sets before you get a doubling. So you have to more than double your volume to get this 100% increase. But it's still quite efficient. If you think about how hard is it to accumulate 10 fractional sets, most people can do that and still not be reaching like the physical activity guidelines that we suggest. If you think about it, you got an upper day, you got a lower day. How hard is it to get 10 fractional sets for, let's say, triceps? You do 1 tricep movement, 3 pushing movements. You can probably get there doing 4 sets per exercise, right? So that'd just be 1 upper body training day, and you're able to actually get to 10 fractional sets for most muscle groups. If you do, a relatively hard day. And most people are training more than once per week who are actually interested in maximizing hypertrophy and are even concerned with this hypertrophy volume relationship. So even your typical push-pull legs 3 times per week setup can probably get you there. Definitely an upper lower would get you there. So it's pretty arguable that, this 10 set point, which was previously shown to be, hey, 10 plus sets, this is great. In Schoenfeld, when we had less data, this is a really high efficiency tier where you're not just getting the minimum 2%, you're getting around 4%. But this is where we start to get to the point where it may become untenable for certain people unless they're dedicated, lifters. To get another 2%, you've got to get all the way up to around 18 or 19 sets. Now, if you think about that, like, what does that look like in the real world? Because you might be like, okay, cool. I definitely want to grow 50% more, going from 4% to 6% in total. And I'm willing to put in the work. I'll do 18, 19 sets. But, hold your horses, because what are we talking about? We're talking about 3 sets on the leg press, squats, leg extensions, lunges, hack squats, and step ups all in the same week just to hit your quad volume, right? Now, if you look at surveys of bodybuilders, they're regularly doing 12 to 24, like the majority of them, sets per week. And that's direct sets. If it was to count that fractionally, probably more like 15 to 25, if I had to guess. So, yeah, bodybuilders are willing to do this. Most of them already are. But are you a bodybuilder? Are you willing to train also 4 to 6 days per week for an hour plus on average? Now, a lot of your listeners, Nick, probably are. You and I both do that. So plenty of people are, but I think it's really important for the personal trainers or the people who are weekend warriors or who are very serious about their fitness, but also very serious about their lives. And their fitness is there to enhance their lives rather than you and I, where fitness is our lives. So I think those perspectives need to be acknowledged. And I think the paper does a really good job of that, because going from, the 5 to 10 set range to the getting around 20 sets is a pretty substantial, it's a very different population in most cases. And then here's where it gets a little nutty. If you want to then get another 2%, right? If you want to get up to an 8% average, this is where you have to go even more. You've got to get up to around 30 sets at this point. And now we're talking crazy time. It's very difficult to get 30 sets in any kind of feasible program where you're still doing the other things that we know are important for hypertrophy, which we can talk about again, all else equal, and have a reasonable, setup. And there's few bodybuilders that are even doing 30 sets per muscle group per week. And like I said, I think there are some, don't get me wrong, but I would venture a guess that probably only maybe 15 to 20% at most of competitive bodybuilders are doing this level of volume. There are time efficiency issues, and there's potentially some practical issues. And another important thing is this diminishing returns effect. It's layered with a certain degree of uncertainty. So there's a lot of confidence in up to around 30 sets if you look at that relationship. But if you were to look at some of the graphs, what you see is around the trend line, there is this ever increasing amount of shaded area that represents the uncertainty. And the uncertainty simply comes down to that we have fewer and fewer and fewer studies as you get higher and higher and higher volume, which makes sense. It's a hard study to conduct. You're going to have less people willing to do it. It's more time consuming. The more volume you do, the more time you have to spend in the lab, the more sessions per week you have to do. So you need more logistical ability to overcome those barriers. You need more research assistants. You need more money. You need more time and availability in the lab. You need potentially more participants if there's going to be more dropouts or just less people actually wanting to participate in the first place, not even dropping out. So one of the other analyses they did is what's called pairwise comparisons. And this is just, instead of looking at the regression, now they look at a fixed given amount of volume, and they use more traditional comparative statistics to see, okay, to what degree of confidence do we have that this number of sets is going to produce greater hypertrophy than lower number of sets? And after 30 sets, you can see that from 31 all the way up to the highest measured volume of 45 sets, the probability that that was better than any lower amount of volume than 30 sets was what we would describe as like non-significant. The probability is low enough that we wouldn't be able to publish it in a single study to say, yes, this was definitely greater. We would say, yeah, the mean was higher, but we can't say that the variability was low enough to say that that was a significant finding, or that we're confident that that would be replicated if we were to repeat this study. So the way I like to describe this relationship is that there's essentially a functional plateau, as far as we can best tell, probably around 30 sets. And I would not have any confidence that on average, people going above 30 sets per week, fractional sets per muscle group, would be actually measurably better in any way that we could tell than doing a lower amount of volume. And that's that point where maybe we're starting to see the on average kind of curve of that inverted U. But it's difficult to say. We need more research on higher volumes. But I think that's primarily looking at this all in a vacuum, all things equal, just looking at the raw relationship. The authors did a great job describing the things that the data can't tell us and the limitations, which I think are, if not as important, almost as, but I think they're actually more important than the findings themselves for people who already are kind of aware of this relationship, to put them into context.
So, before we get to the limitations, which I want to hear about, I have a question. So, if I understood what you said correctly, then what we're talking about here is the increase in hypertrophy, measurable increase over about 10.5 weeks. So, if I said, okay, then I'm going to run a 12-week program, just to be on the safe side, I'll do 12 weeks instead of 10.5, where I want to be in tier 4, I want an 8% increase, and I'm going to focus on one muscle group, and I'm going to do 30 fractional sets of that muscle group. Does that mean that I need to do 30 sets in perpetuity to maintain the size that I will achieve in 12 weeks? Or can I do less and maintain that size?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is you probably do not need to do that amount. And there's a big difference between what amount of volume maximizes the rate of progress you can make and what amount of volume is the minimum effective dose to maintain a given level of size. And I think this is where a lot of people kind of get it twisted. And you might be looking at someone who's an advanced lifter doing a relatively low amount of volume. But the question is not, oh, well, if I want to be an advanced lifter and they do kind of a HIIT style protocol, do I only need to do 4 to 8 sets, with a high intensity, with effective exercises and a lot of, effort to get to that physique? The question is, did that person during their entire 20-year, 30-year training career that you see, were they always training with 4 to 8 sets to failure? Or are they currently training with that amount? Or is that the appropriate amount? So the minimum amount, like how much volume you quote unquote need, is very different than the amount of volume that you can potentially benefit from and grow faster. And this is actually demonstrated really well in other studies that aren't represented in this meta-analysis, because that's not what this meta-analysis asked. Essentially, what you're looking for is, what is the amount of volume that allows no change in hypertrophy? And then does it change once you've done higher volume to get somewhere? And I would say it probably only escalates if you needed to do that amount of volume to get there. So what do I mean by that? So there was a really interesting study, and this is on strength. So we don't have long-term data in hypertrophy, so you'll have to forgive me, Nick. But I believe it was Steele and colleagues, and they specifically looked over 6 to 8 years at 15,000 almost people training in a chain of training studios where they do one set to failure in a circuit with a personal trainer, and actually momentary failure observed using a relatively slow tempo. So it's kind of like a HIIT protocol if you look at kind of the old school high intensity protocol. And they measured their strength gains over time. And there was a plateau around the 1 to 2 year mark. And on average, or at the highest amount, actually, there was a 50% increase from strength from baseline. Now, that's not very good. Like if you look at many studies out there, you can see 50% increases on average in terms of strength over 12 weeks. So what that tells me is, at least for strength, which probably has some similar relationship to hypertrophy, if not being, identical, a single set to failure, even pushing it to the hardest you can in that individual set, is insufficient to ever get to the point where we might describe you as an intermediate. It's getting you to the point where in your first 3 to 4 months of training you might get to, and then you just plateau on average. So that means that there is a minimum amount of work that you probably need to do to get to a certain level of advancement in terms of your development relative to your own potential. So while the minimum effective dose to grow for a complete novice at the weight room might be 1 set, the minimum the minimum dose to maintain size is going to be way more than 1 set when you get to a higher level. But it's not going to be astronomical. It might only be 8 sets, 9 sets, 10 sets, or something like that, because you have to think about what is progressive overload in its truest sense. It's really just overload, right? If you're providing overload, which in this case, let's say that is a set to a sufficient proximity to failure, that is going to be enough until it's no longer enough. There is going to let's take for example someone who has they've only done 2 squats with body weight in a row at most. That one time they dropped their keys after getting off the toilet, they had to squat back down, so they've done 2 squats with body weight. That's it. That's what they're adapted to. You could put a empty barbell on their back and have them do sets of 5, and they would start to get stronger and probably grow muscle just doing that once a week. But how long would they keep getting stronger and bigger from just doing an empty bar for 5 reps, once a week? Maybe a month, you know? And then at a certain point, now they're not going to get bigger. And if they took the bar off their back and they just went back to, squatting once or twice per day to a toilet and nothing else, they'd probably lose a little bit of size. So that is a little bit of a microcosm of what happens at higher and higher and higher levels. So overload is just simply meeting the minimum threshold for adaptation based upon the adaptations you've already made. And you can demonstrate this by looking at other adaptations as well. So for example, if you look at elite cyclists, we're talking people with over a 70 VO2 max, people who are training hard, busting their asses. They're training 10 to 15 hours per week. And when I say training for 10 to 15 hours, I don't mean resting 2 minutes between each set. This is continuous movement, right? So it's like real sports, okay? These cyclists can cut their volume down to just training 6 hours per week. And so long as they're doing like 1-hit interval session, they can maintain those adaptations for months, maybe longer. Now, if you take that 6 hours per week of training, that is more than double the amount that sedentary, elderly, untrained people need to maximize the amount of cardiorespiratory adaptations they can get in a given time frame. Is insufficient to maintain what is barely sufficient to maintain an adaptation in an elite athlete, an endurance sport, is more than the amount needed to maximize the adaptation in an untrained person. And there is some, transfer to that concept, although the numbers don't scale perfectly when you talk about resistance training, right? If it takes 4 sets to be the minimum effective dose, that's probably somewhere around, what we might need to maintain. And remember that this meta-regression by Pellin and colleagues is on a mixture of untrained and trained individuals. So it's probably a little bit higher than that for a really well-trained person. It's probably a little bit lower than that, and obviously a lot lower than that for a completely untrained person. 1 set to failure is going to produce strength gains for up to 1 to 2 years. And I would think some component of that would be hypertrophy. But the rate of gain is so slow that you would be like a early stage, intermediate, late stage novice at the end of those 2 years, and you just stay there. Most people don't want that. Most people are willing to do more than 1 set. And especially when they start to plateau, they'd be like, well, maybe I can do another set. This only takes 30 seconds, right? So I think the reality is that whatever amount of volume you needed to get to a given adaptation, some close number to that is going to be what you need to maintain it. But typically, the more advanced athletes out there are doing more than they need because they're trying to gain as quickly as they can. And the experience of seeing these diminished returns, not related to the amount of volume you're doing, but diminished returns from becoming closer and closer to your genetic potential, getting more and more advanced, is something that athletes don't just take sitting down. They do everything in their power. They figure out, can I do more? Can I train harder? Can I train in unique, novel ways to try to replicate my intermediate or my beginner phase? They often can't, but we certainly try. So there's another really cool study also on strength. Again, it's much easier to have large, long-term data sets on strength. Latella and colleagues, they looked at the open powerlifting database. Now, most powerlifters, before they start competing, have been lifting weights for 3 to 4 years. So they've already made their newbie gains, right? and they look at, okay, what happens in their up to a 17-year long career once they start actually competing, and we have their numbers from this powerlifting database. And in the first year, on average, we're seeing like a 20% increase in their total. That's pretty cool. Like, let's say you're, a middleweight, pretty gifted male powerlifter, you total 500 kilos, right? At the end of your first year, you're going to be totaling around 600 kilos on average, with all else equal. Amazing. You're super motivated. Sweet. Next year, I'm going to be hitting 700 kilos. Unfortunately, not. To get another 20% increase takes another 9 years of training on average. So there's this very steep diminishing returns that come with time spent. And the closer and closer you get to your genetic potential, the slower and slower your progress comes. And this is despite competitive powerlifters, competitive modern powerlifters. We look at data from like 2022 and later, training 6 to 10 hours per week, 3 to 6 days per week, right? Again, that's not the same number of hours, it's not continuous movement, but it's a lot of training. They're doing much higher volumes than what is probably the minimum effective dose when you look at other research. They're not just doing, say, 3 to 6 sets per week. If you look at their main lifts plus accessory work, they're probably doing something similar to bodybuilders, although very different set structures, lower reps, heavier loads, 15, 20 sets if you start to look at the fractional comparisons. So I think that's really important to understand, is that many advanced lifters think they need to do higher volume, but it's not that they need to do higher volume. It's that they would find the rates of progress from lower volume to be unacceptably slow, because they're looking at their competitor. It's not just, like if I add 2.5 kilos in the next 2 years on my squat, I'm good with that. Some are, but if you're someone who is trying to get on the podium at Worlds, you're thinking, okay, my total is 680. Silver and bronze are totaling around 700. How do I add 20 kilos to my total this year? And then you'll be hell-bent to try to do it, and decent chance you get hurt trying to do it, but you're damn well going to try, because that's the mentality of competitive athletes. So it's not just looking at what is the minimum detectable change that I can use if I'm using like newtons or millimeters on an ultrasound. I want to be able to see that I'm placing better at WNBF Worlds by next year, or I'm placing higher at IPF Worlds by next year, or that I'm moving up the ranks, or I qualify for nationals, or that I get a pro card. So I think in most cases, we can't look at advanced lifters and say, hey, what are you doing? And is that the minimum effective dose or the appropriate dose? We have to understand their history, their motivation, where they have been and where they are, and knowing that not everyone sits on the same spot on this, relationship. For one person's low volume, that might be some other person's high volume. And for you, in different circumstances, your low volume might be your high volume, if you were to change your environment. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but it's something that I think a lot about, and something that I'm actually writing about in mass coming up for the December issue.
Oh, don't apologize. I wanted all the details. Why are we on a podcast? If I just wanted the 90-second reel, I would have looked on your Instagram account.
That's right.
I'm wondering, though, speaking of time, if you have time for one more question.
Always.
Because you've mentioned the limitations of this paper, and I was wondering if you could cover them within this frame. Can you also answer the question, when we have a new study coming out, especially in the age of social media, there are a lot of different interpretations that you can find within the first 20 minutes of the study actually coming out. And I'm not sure that these interpretations are usually appropriate to the type of study and what the researchers intended. So when you explain the limitations of this research, could you also explain what we can make of this meta-analysis in practice and what would be an inappropriate use of this particular study?
Absolutely. And I totally agree that because there is an effect on social media engagement of who is first to comment, that leads to, unfortunately, less nuanced comments. Like, I guarantee you, if someone posted about the meta regression within hours of it coming out, they physically could not have read the whole paper with any kind of depth, or all of the supplementary materials that came out. So it is going to understandably be a potentially erroneous interpretation of it, or at least not fully correct. So that is something to be very aware of. And if you want to have a nuanced understanding of the research, you probably don't want to be relying entirely on the loudest voice that said something about it quickly, even if they are in the quote unquote evidence-based space. And you probably should, whenever possible, actually see what the authors themselves are putting out. And fortunately, like you said, the data-driven strength guys are putting out data on this, but that's not always the case. So, that's the whole reason why you and I do what we do, right? So I think the best way to frame the answer to your question is let's ask, what does this study really tell us versus what do we want to know? What I think most people want to know is, how much volume should I do in perpetuity? How much volume should I do now? Should I increase my volume? And am I doing enough? And what will happen if I do too much? They want to know very practical questions. And we have to then go, okay, but does this meta-analysis tell us those answers? And in many cases, the answer is no. So what this meta-analysis tells us is that on average, over 10 and a half weeks, if you do a protocol, which is not super ecologically valid, and I'll explain why in a second, and you focus on just 1 to 3 muscle groups, and you train the hell out of them, and you get closer and closer to 30 sets, that will produce more growth in those muscles in that time frame than if you had done less volume. So here's the thing. When you include only studies on direct measurements of muscle size, like ultrasound, MRI, etc., when you run that study, you're going to damn well make sure that you train those muscle groups. And you're going to think about the logistical feasibility of this study. And in fact, you may not train the other muscles at all. So if you're doing a study purely on biceps in untrained individuals, you know what? You're going to come in and have them do bicep curls only, right? 1 set, 3 set, 5 set, 3 times a week. Cool. Now we have 3, 9, and 15 set comparison of the biceps. Are they doing triceps? No, they're not doing anything else. These are untrained participants. They don't care. Okay. That's a very obviously limited thing that we can't take much from as trained lifters trying to understand how much volume we should do. That really only tells about the relationship between higher and lower volumes in untrained people for biceps hypertrophy. So let's take a slightly more ecologically valid comparison. Okay, now we're going to do ultrasound of the quads and the biceps. So we're going to give these trained, reasonably well-trained individuals a program, but we're going to make sure we train the hell out of their quads and biceps. So you're going to see bicep curls, lat pull downs, rows, leg extensions, leg press, and squats in the protocol. Now, how do we make sure that the participants stay in this study and don't go like, what about leg curls? What about chest press? Like, I want to do those things. Okay, we'll give you a little bit of that. That's option 1. Or, hey, we can supervise you while you do training outside of the study. And there's an inverse relationship between how much volume someone is willing to do on other muscle groups outside of the study and how much volume they had to do inside of the study for the group they were in. So I bet your ass, if you are asked in a study to do 45 sets for quads and biceps, and you're told, hey, you can train these other muscle groups outside of it, you'll say at the start of the study, yes, sounds good. And then in 2 weeks, you're like barely doing half a tricep pushdown because you're so exhausted from the 45 sets of biceps and quads. But the other group who you're compared against, they might be doing more of that. So what we really know is that specialization programs that last 2 to 3 months are very effective for growing that very specific muscle. We don't know that a well-balanced, full body, typical bodybuilding split, legs push, pull, upper, lower, or something like that, where every single muscle group is being done for 30 sets, is actually sustainable in the first place or going to produce better outcomes. So I think it's just really important to know that. And then it's also important to know those other aspects that I already brought up but are worth repeating, that the volume relationship only explains about a quarter of the hypertrophy we observe, which means you don't just focus on volume and forget about proximity to failure, training at longer muscle lengths, rest periods, exercise selection, nutrition, training environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All those things are collectively 3 times as important as the amount of volume you're doing, right? And additionally, we also need to think about just the fact that this is not a literal understanding of the relationship. It is a conceptual one with all else equal. To illustrate this, if you were to take this meta-regression at pure face value, you'd go, okay, cool. 20 sets of leg extensions with a 5-minute rest interval and to a 5 RIR are just as effective as 20 sets of squats with a 2-minute rest interval to a zero RIR, or to actual momentary failure for quads. And it won't matter. Nothing else matters because we're just looking at this relationship. Of course, we know those are going to be very different experiences for the participants involved. That has not changed, and this volume meta-regression doesn't contradict that. We just have to be able to hold the fact that we're looking at an isolated relationship with all else equal in our minds, and that's what I think most people struggle with. This tells us less about what to do in the gym on Tuesday and more about the broad relationship between volume and hypertrophy that we have to hold in mind with our broad relationship between RIR and hypertrophy and all these other factors. I think the other really important thing to understand is not just what the data doesn't tell you, but what the data can't tell you. And specifically, we don't typically do what's called intention to treat analyses in exercise science, which means that we count the people who did not complete the protocol and we look at how the protocols influenced things, counting those people, which typically diminishes the effect. Now, this is really important in public health and nutrition. If we say, hey, we want you to follow a ketogenic diet and see how effective that was, and a bunch of people report like, I really couldn't adhere to it, we don't just say, no, screw that. You're kicked out of the study. How dare you not adhere to this study? We saw great results from ketogenic diets. Everyone should do it. We go, oh, actually, only 30% of people, and these are made up numbers, by the way, only 30% of people could stick to this diet. This probably isn't good public health advice. Even though the completers did well, the intention to treat indicates that there's some type of issue with adherence or dropouts, could be safety, whatever. Because we don't do that in resistance training research, we don't know how many people self-selected to not even participate. Oh, 40 sets? No, thank you. I'll come back when you give me some free creatine and I don't have to do as much work for your lab. Or I dropped out of the study and I'm not counted. Now, I'm not aware of any systematic issue of higher volume studies having more dropouts. I'm not claiming that. It's just we simply can't see where the inverted U might be occurring. All I can say is that for studies that on average are 10 and a half weeks, we don't see poorer hypertrophy from doing tons and tons in volume. But in the real world, there must be an inverted U. It is an undeniable reality, even if the data doesn't show it, because there is a point where doing more and more work becomes a negative. And given that volume is only explaining about 25% of the relationship with hypertrophy, I would say the point at which doing more volume detracts for anything else that could potentially influence hypertrophy, it's probably too much volume. It's probably working against you. If you start to video record your sets and you've gone from say 15 to 25 and you're going, you know what, let's pump it up based upon this meta regression, and your RIR is getting further from failure, not worth it. If you're pumping up, your volume and you're finding that you're sore, you're beat up, and it's inhibiting your ability to sleep effectively through the night, probably not worth it. If it's detracting from your time so much that it's negatively affecting your social relationships and causing you interpersonal stress that you're struggling to manage, and it's creating problems for you and creating a worse environment for adaptation, because we know that the perceived number of negative life events and social stress actually detracts from your ability to adapt to resistance training. We have multiple studies on this, probably not worth it. And I think to give credit to the data-driven strength guys, they did a very good job of explaining what their take is, that volume is beneficial until it starts working against you. And I think this is what that means. If adding more volume produces obvious decrements to your recovery environment, your nutritional adherence, your sleep, or your ability to do other aspects of quote unquote training quality, if you're not able to keep a focus and target the muscle and train it closer to failure, if you're starting to select exercises that are suboptimal because you don't want to deal with the setup time because it just takes too long, that's probably not worth it. I think you do not want to sacrifice quote unquote training quality for training quantity. And at the point where you start to see that happening more and more, that is at least currently the threshold where adding more volume is probably not beneficial. The final thing I'd say, and this is actually something that I find quite empowering from the analysis, and something I've used personally as a lifter, is I'm no longer afraid of where is that insidious inverted U start. Like where is it where I start adding more volume that it's actually going to make me grow slower, but I just won't know it? Because that was a possibility that we could have seen in the data when we had less. Now it just really seems like the raw kind of non-real world relationship, just kind of the theoretical relationship, is not one of an inverted U, at least until you get to maybe a lot higher volumes where you can't actually repair all the muscle damage. Looking at this just from a pure physiological level, you can get into the 30, 40 set range, and I don't think that you're actually going to be growing slower if you had all the perfect environment to be able to recover from and do that volume, which is unlikely in most cases. Rather, you're going to experience all those things I just described. You're going to try to increase the volume, and something else is going to give. And I think something else giving is really important to consider, because we actually don't have data indicating that true overtraining syndrome is something that's likely to occur from resistance training alone. Rather, what we see is that injury or burnout or pain or other issues are more likely to occur before that happens, because true overtraining syndrome is defined by multiple months or longer of suppressed performance that doesn't return back to baseline even when you take time off from training. This is rare even in endurance training and team sports, but it does happen. It's so rare as to potentially be almost logistically impossible, if not infeasible, in resistance training. We do see non-functional overreaching, where you take that time off. It's been less than 3 months or 2 months or so, maybe 2 months at most, and performance comes back up to baseline, but not higher. But true overtraining syndrome is super rare. And in my practical experience and in some research, it's more likely that the wheels will fall off proverbially or almost literally, although you don't have wheels, you have limbs, when you're trying to get to the point where you might otherwise overtrain. In fact, the only study I'm aware of that was able to actually induce something that, in not all participants, but some, was true overtraining syndrome, was a study by Fry in the 2000s. And they had them do, this is crazy, Nick, this is gonna blow your mind. They took a squat machine, okay? And they have them work up to a 1RM, okay? So they do a 1RM, the heaviest single they can do, and they go, sweet, now we're gonna do that 10 times. And each time they're unable to complete it from cumulative fatigue, they would drop the load 5 pounds. 5 pounds, and they would have to do it again. Failed attempts, they didn't count. So they had to get 10 1RMs, including fatigue. And they went, sweet, I'll see you tomorrow, and the next day, and every day for 2 weeks. So they had to do 10 successful 1RM squats every day for 2 weeks. And this did produce overtraining syndrome in a handful of the participants, but it was actually non-functional overreaching in most of them. And there was
I'm
one
surprised it
case
didn't
study.
produce death.
Yeah, I mean, like, so in one case, there was someone who actually got a knee injury that was so severe that the doctor couldn't, they had to basically describe it as something new. There was this neural inhibition where the central joint loading would like turn off their quads and they would collapse under it regularly. And, this is awesome that participants so hardcore that they're like, I'm going to keep trying. So that is how resilient force production is. When you think about it, our ability to produce high forces, high power, this is our survival get out of jail card. Like this is, yeah, for hunting, yes, we need to be able to run a long time, tire out these animals that have more fast twitch fibers. This is why we're here today as a global tribe coming from these small hunter-gatherer societies. But we want to make sure we don't get eaten by the tiger like right now. We need to jump up a tree. So our body is very good at making sure the last thing to degrade from overtraining or fatigue is raw, quick force production. We can generate a lot of ATP all at once. We can't sustain it. And that seems to be the last thing to go. So whether or not you're inducing sufficient overtraining to regress is unlikely in resistance training, but you will have all kinds of heaps of other problems related to burnout, potential injury, non-functional overreaching, just getting suboptimal gains or hating your life or just being unable to stick with it. So the practical concerns are substantial, and I think they really need to be acknowledged. If you just look at this as this is how I should train and I want to get the most out of my body as possible, give me their MAV, I'm going to do 30 sets. For, I would say, 9 out of 10 people, 30 sets is going to be completely unsustainable. And the real option on how do I do that is you need to start being creative. You think about rotating specialization cycles, which is actually what we know. I have more confidence in specialization cycles from this meta-regression than I do a full body, ecologically valid, 6-day upper lower, where you're trying really hard, training 2 hours per session to get up to 30 sets per muscle group. So that is typically how I implement it in the real world. We rotate in more advanced lifters through these specialization cycles, push higher volumes on those while we put the other muscle groups onto a level of volume that's probably still sufficient to grow, just in those lower efficiency tiers, like, 8 to 15 sets at most type of deal.
Thank you, Eric. I actually would respond to everything you said, but this would prolong the conversation beyond your time constraints today. So I'm not going to do that because you've already given me and the audience so much value today. I'm really thankful for your time and your knowledge, as always. But before we wrap up, let the people know where they can connect with you. And if there's anything that you want to plug, I'll put everything in the show notes as usual.
Yeah, I would say first, thank you for having me on. Always happy to be back on, and I always appreciate how respectful of my time you are, and always for the stimulative questions. And I find myself going off on these long tangents, and I'm like, that was a good question because it got me excited. So thank you for having me on. If anyone wants to do, deep dives on this topic, we do that a lot, and I'm always the one in the crew for mass where I'm talking about the hypertrophy stuff, the bodybuilding stuff. I do also talk about strength because I do like that as well. But nonetheless, check out massresearchreview.com. In the issue, our last issue of 2024 that is coming out, I got a question from the mailbag. That's what we call it. Do advanced lifters need more volume? And I wrote like a close to 5,000 word article specifically talking about that goes into a lot of depth with a lot of examples, good figures. I talk a lot about the specific meta regression. I talk a lot about the studies I discussed. If someone is interested in that, they might find that. If this was interesting, you're going to love that article. So I'd encourage you to check that out.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. And until next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.